What we want to speak about tonight, really just three simple things, three simple questions I'm going to try to answer based on a document that was put out by the Catholic bishops back in March, actually. And those three questions are, quite simply, what are we talking about when we speak about religious liberty? Why is it our first freedom? Which is a question that's being debated. And in what sense do we consider religious liberty our most cherished freedom? As Jim mentioned, this is a major question nowadays, although you may not be aware of it. Last week, lawsuits were filed in federal court on behalf of 43 Catholic plaintiffs, ranging from Catholic organizations to hospitals to schools to dioceses. And you may not have heard about that because, according to one news analysis I was reading, neither NBC nor ABC covered any of it. This question of religious liberty or religious freedom is something that, of course, is playing its way through the courts now, but as the bishops are trying to make us aware of, it's bigger than a legal question. And that's what I want to try to explore with you tonight. The goal is really to get you to realize that this is something that is not a church problem or a church issue. It's not even a Catholic issue. This is a United States of America question. And the way things are going, that freedom is in jeopardy. And I'll show you why. What is religious liberty? The classic answer is it's a freedom from interference by the government. Everyone knows the long-held tradition of the separation of church and state, which is where in the Constitution? Nowhere. Right? A lot of elementary grade school kids don't realize that when they take the test. It's not. But it is part of our tradition. It actually came from a court case. But the idea, of course, is that church and state should be separate, in the sense that the state shouldn't tell you what your religion is. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania does not make us all be Quakers. Okay. Well, it works the other way too. Right? Church should not interfere in what the state is doing. Right? We've been able to hold those two things together for a couple of hundred years now. Right? More so than lots of countries everywhere in the world. But this is not just an American proposition. It was actually the teaching at the Second Vatican Council. Second Vatican Council put it into words. The human person has a right to religious freedom. And that freedom means that all men are immune from coercion. Now, I want you to notice this. Right? The Church's teaching at the Second Vatican Council is that religious freedom is something for everybody. And if you continue through the quote, it ends there by saying that religious freedom is to be recognized in constitutional law and become a civil right. Notice the order of that. You are free because you're a human being. And that's why it goes into law. Not because the law says so, you are free. That's a fundamental position. We're free because we're human beings. The law just says so. Right? We're going to see in a moment, right? When that law gets changed, it's trying to say something it can't say. Right? So, firstly, this idea of religious liberty as freedom from interference. Secondly, religious liberty as a freedom to do something, a freedom to worship. Every one of us is free to gather in the church or synagogue or wherever and worship however it is we worship. That's a basic freedom of assembly. The difficulty nowadays, and it's almost subconscious, and in many cases may or may not be intentional, but the difficulty nowadays is that you'll hear in a lot of rhetoric that we're trying to reduce religious liberty to freedom to worship. You are free to be religious in your house of religion all you want. Period. There's the question. Is religion just a matter of being enclosed in the four walls of a church or a synagogue to worship as you please? Or is religion something bigger than that? We're going to say it's something bigger than that, and we're not the only ones. And this gets us to what I think is the real definition of religious liberty, which is a freedom for something. And to put it quite simply, it's a freedom for figuring out life. It's a freedom for coming up with your conception of what's a good life? What's the purpose of it all? What are we doing here? Whatever your answer to that isn't the issue. It's whether or not I can conceive of what is good in this world. To give you a sense that it's not just a Catholic issue, Leon Kass, I'm not sure if you can see this back there, Leon Kass, who's a Jewish bioethicist, he used to be the chair of the President's Commission on Bioethics, gave a speech just recently this year where he spoke about the idea of human beings as being religious without using that word. Talks about things like what we think about work and love and service. The idea that human beings have values is a religious thing. Religious in the sense that we are somehow, as he puts it, oriented beyond ourselves. There's an idea of good, or there's an idea of success, or there's an idea of fulfillment. Now, some of us attach the word God to that and have a conception of that. But the idea that we can freely, for ourselves, figure out what's valuable, that's religious freedom. And that's what we're talking about here. It's a different, it's a broader concept than you'll hear in debates about the issue. Leon Kass says, whether we know it or not, we are theotropic, oriented toward the divine, because we sense in ourselves and in our fellow human beings a divine-like possibility and a penchant for the good. To be free to think that and to act on it is what we're trying to defend. So, quick little summary here. I get this, spacebar. What is religious liberty? Freedom from interference by the government, or vice versa. Freedom to worship, and freedom for conceiving of what is good. Now, why is this the first of our freedoms? Well, again, if you take that idea that religion is how we conceive of the meaning of life, and we, again, attach God to that, we include God in that. But the general idea that freedom is about how we conceive of the meaning of life, well, that's what human culture is. It's the playing out of that in our everyday lives. As Blessed John Paul II said, and I will just mention as an aside, I think his concept of culture is perhaps the greatest thing he ever taught. We probably have a few decades to see whether or not I'm right on that one. But his idea was that human beings are part of a culture. We're all affected by it, every one of us. Right? We're affected by, for instance, the culture of how fast things work. I remember being in Italy when they opened the first McDonald's in Rome. Traumatic event, by the way. Right? They had an eat-in, and all the restaurants came out with pizza, and they sat in the streets and protested. But anyway, the elderly Roman couple goes into McDonald's and sits down. And after an hour, they left because the service was so terrible. They didn't have the concept of fast food, right? Which, by the way, is a contradiction of terms to a good Italian, fast food. Right? That's a culture thing. We're all affected by that. Nowadays, we want food fast. We expect it fast, because that's what we've grown up with. All right, that's the general idea. But he also says we shape the culture we live in by the choices we make. So, right? The first most important task when it comes to human culture has to do with the choices we make in terms of understanding what our destiny is. We choose to believe something about life. And then we spend our lives trying to live that. Therefore, the position we take towards fundamental events like birth, love, work, death, and ultimately the question of God, that's what human culture is. They're religious questions. So again, what I'm trying to emphasize here, what the bishop's document emphasizes is, this is not a Catholic Church thing. Right? It's a human being issue. Oops. This idea, though not in the theological terms, has always been incorporated in our country's founding documents. And so the bishop's document will quote George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and what they have to say about religious freedom. I've taken the liberty, pun intended, to add a few other quotes from these characters. George Washington. Right? The establishment of civil and religious liberty was the motive that induced me to the field of battle. He's ready to fight for it. He also said, though, while we're contending for our liberty, we have to be cautious not to violate the rights of conscience in others. Notice who he wrote that to. Benedict Arnold. You are also free to be a traitor. If we're really going to champion freedom, then we're going to have to deal with that. Thomas Jefferson, no friend to religion, by the way, right? The one who penned the idea of, or certainly championed the idea of the separation of church and state, nevertheless, wrote in reference to the Ursuline sisters who were being harassed for what they were doing, that the principles of the Constitution are a sure guarantee that you are not going to be interfered with. It goes back to that freedom from concept. But he also wrote to the Baptists in Virginia, where he was from, who were trying to make religion the government, right? Flip it around, they were trying to make religion the government. He says, we've already solved this question of whether religion and government are compatible. Thomas Jefferson said, we have solved it. In the 21st century, we seem to have forgotten the solution, as you'll see. And then, of course, there's James Madison, whose writings were quoted by the Chief Justice in a recent Supreme Court case, right, that spoke about the Constitution guarding against interfering with religious tasks, like selecting who was going to work in a church. And then he said, and I left the Old English in here, the tendency to usurpation on one side or the other, to a corrupting coalition or alliance between church and state, will best be guarded against by an entire abstinence of the government from interference in any way whatsoever. Again, we seem to have forgotten that. And so, religious liberty, as we've understood it, as it has been part of our history as a country, is under threat. Just to remind you of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's what they refer to as the Establishment Clause. The church cannot establish a religion, the state cannot establish a religion, or prohibit the free exercise thereof. It's especially that second one, although some folks are arguing nowadays that the first one is also up in the air, where the state is trying to become its own religion. But it's the second one that I think is where the rubber hits the road for all of us. How is religious liberty under attack? I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but there are lots of examples. Right, local laws. It was the University of California, Hastings, that prohibited, for the first time in their history, a student group called the Christian Legal Society, because why they refused to recognize them and fund them, and the courts backed this up. The Christian Legal Society required that their officers be Christians. And the university said, you can't do that. And the courts backed them up. An example of local questions about religious freedom. At the state level, I'm sure you've read stories about foster care agencies, adoption services in Washington, D.C., Illinois, a couple other states that are literally choosing to go out of business because they will not agree to do what the government requires, which is to provide contraception, abortion-inducing drugs, and sterilization as part of their policies. They will go out of business first. Catholic Humanitarian Services, the services provided to refugees. The Catholic Church has been assisting with that for untold numbers of years. And we're just lost, again, another lawsuit that says you have to provide these services, contrary to your religious beliefs. And of course, the federal cases. The church minister's case was also referred to as the Hosanna Tabor case. That was a church out in the Midwest, I'm sorry, I forget where, that fired one of their school teachers for basically not living up to what they defined as being a minister of their church, which is what the school teachers are considered. The lawsuit went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court unanimously, which is the shocking thing, unanimously said, of course the religious school can decide who their teachers are going to be. Of course they can. The government can't decide what a minister is or isn't. And then, of course, you have the now famous Health and Human Services mandate that is requiring that every employer, basically, provide contraception, abortion-inducing drugs, and sterilization programs, right? Or pay for them, if not directly provide them. Right? Now, as I mentioned last night, I'm going to mention this to all of you in case you're not aware of that. That is the law. It's not something that's being debated. It's the law. Every organization, every Catholic university, every Catholic hospital, every Catholic social service has to provide those things. As of, I believe it's August. Right? They gave us a little time to try to implement it. Right? The debate's over. That's the law. Which is why this religious freedom concern has to become really important before that kicks in. Right? And that's why the bishops are speaking about this campaign. As they say in their document, why is religious liberty the first freedom? Because if we are not free in our conscience and our practice of religion, then everything else becomes fragile. Right? Every other freedom, right, is in jeopardy. Martin Luther King also wrote that in terms of this question of law, right, he speaks about, he agrees with St. Augustine, who speaks about an unjust law. Right? Now, why do I mention this? This is a quote from the bishop's document. Precisely because there seems to be a discussion about the idea of how we're going to accommodate this law or tailor this law or work it out, as if it could be accommodated, if it could be worked in somehow. The reason the bishops quote Martin Luther King is because the law, which as I just mentioned, which is the law, is not a just law. It can't be fixed. It has to be repealed. That's the debate the U.S. Supreme Court is having right now. Okay? In other words, this is not something we can figure out how to apply. It's wrong from the get-go because it attacks the very core of freedom. Okay? To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, this is Martin Luther King quoting Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law or natural law. It's not rooted in what freedom is. Right? And that is why so many people are in an uproar. Okay? All right, so why is it our first freedom? Search for the good, the rights that we have. It is the foundation to all other freedoms. Which gets us to the last piece here. Right? Why is religious liberty our most cherished freedom? Well, this goes back, certainly it's been part of our tradition, but you may or may not recall from your Catholic history lessons a Jesuit professor by the name of John Courtney Murray. He's actually, behind the scenes, the author of the Vatican II document on religious liberty. He's the one who figured out how you balance, he's the one who figured out how to express how you balance religion, belief, and civil liberty. And he pointed out in his writings, this famous book of his, We Hold These Truths, that in terms of the American experience, that's always been part and parcel of who we are, this religious freedom. He says, where this kind of language about natural law and morality, where this kind of language is taught, Catholics join the conversation with complete ease, because that's Catholic language. It's not a foreign concept to us until today. It's part of our tradition, which is why, again, earlier this year, a group called the Evangelicals and Catholics, a large evangelical group especially, put together this document called In Defense of Freedom, and they put it very succinctly. As part of our Christian tradition, we object to a naked public square. What are they talking about? They're talking about public debate and dialogue and discussion and legislation that has nothing to do with religion. Because if that's part of people's lives, then it has to come into discussion. At the same time, however, they reject the idea of a sacred public square, meaning that religion determines legislation, public policy, that sort of thing. What we seek, they say, is a civil public square, where all citizens can make their contribution to the common good. And this is what fascinates me about listening to debates and engaging in debates. If you watch debates about touchy subjects, and they're always the fun ones, right, the sort of social controversies, as soon as something smacks of religion, the debate's over. Because one side on the debate will say, you can't bring religion into this. My response is always, how can I not bring religion into this? And not because of what I'm wearing. Because if religion is how we think about life, how can I not bring that into any discussion? Doesn't mean you have to agree with me. That's the beauty of the American tradition. We argue things. Hopefully we don't kill each other when we do. But to debate, that's what we're about. Well, why should any idea be excluded from the debate? If it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea, no matter where it comes from. You might tell me your reason for arguing this is because, I don't know, some imaginary blue monster told you to. Okay, great. I think you're nuts, but all right, you're going to say that, say that. Why do we exclude anything? Except nowadays we exclude something that smacks of religion. Because it sounds like, and this is the argument you're going to hear, you are trying to force your religious beliefs on me. I'm not trying to force anything on anybody. But those religious beliefs might be a good idea once in a while. This is what the document is arguing for, in defense of religious freedom. Why not grapple with all the ideas? Why is religious liberty our most cherished freedom? A second reason, oh, that didn't show up there. Our institutions. I just happened to find this graphic online, this bingo card. It is a Catholic audience, right? Bingo card. Right? The YWCA, the Lions Club, the Cub Scouts, the PTA, the Rotary, if you look, Salvation Army, Meals on Wheels, if you look at all these institutions, they're all religious, at least in their inception. Why? Because religious people like to care for others. It's part of what we think the world's about, taking care of your neighbor. These kinds of institutions, these what the sociologists will call the mediating institutions, mediating between government and the actual person on the street who's suffering. Those institutions make for a pretty good life. They make our society. we cherish that idea that we can organize in that way. Well, that's what's in jeopardy. Take Catholic Social Services, they're out of business. Take Sacred Heart Hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital in Reading, they're out of business if this law goes through. That's the scary part. Marianne Glendon, the former ambassador of the United States to the Holy See, said, "At the deepest level, we are witnessing an attack on the institutions of civil society that are essential to limited government and that are important buffers between the citizen and the all-powerful state." Those things are going to go away. That's the scary part. Cardinal George in Chicago was quoted as saying, in the Catholic directory, the directory of all the organizations, institutions, and stuff in Chicago, there are 4 pages of hospitals, schools, social agencies. He said to the people of Chicago, be ready to say goodbye, because he will shut them all down before he gives in to this law. Whoa. Even the Jewish rabbis have taught the same. They came out with a statement saying the most troubling thing about the HHS mandate, right, is that it appears that religion has to be relegated to the private sphere, which is completely contrary to the Jewish religion. Right? Again, it's about taking care of your neighbor as well as praying to God. They go together. Which is why in the bishop's document it says, without religious liberty properly understood, all Americans suffer. Deprived of the essential contribution in education, healthcare, feeding the hungry, civil rights, social services. If those things go away, everybody suffers. Not just the Catholics. Everybody. So, because of this cherishing of our religious liberty, it was Pope Benedict II who issued this sort of challenge to everyone in an quirky, I should probably say providential sense of timing. It was in January when he was meeting with some of the U.S. bishops that he gave this talk. And so once more, we see the need for an engaged, articulate, and well-formed Catholic laity, endowed with a strong critical sense with regard to the culture and the courage to counter that reductive secularism. What he's saying, in one sentence that took me 20 minutes to say, is that this idea of reducing freedom, religious freedom, to just being about worship and not being about the public good has to be countered. And has to be countered, he says, by a well-formed, articulate, engaged laity. That would be you. I can stand here, I can stand at a Legatus meeting, I can stand in front of my classroom, I can stand in a pulpit and talk about this. But it's not going to change if it's coming from me, or the bishops, or the pastors, who are, just do the math, a real minority. This has to come from the church, understood as every single person in it. That's what the Holy Father is challenging, not only the folks in our country, but really around the world. What is that challenge, he says? The bishops say in their document, to be Catholic and American should mean not having to choose one over the other. We haven't had to since the founding. We might have to now. Our Catholic faith, the bishops write, oblige us to work together with fellow citizens for the common good of all who live in this land. Again, this is not a Catholic argument. It's an American one. It's a human one, for that matter. George Weigel puts it in a little bit stronger terms, as George tends to do. What is at stake here is nothing less than the future of civil society in the U.S. That sounds a little bombastic, but it's real. what is at stake is the future of civil society in this country. Again, it's part of our tradition, it's our institutions. We have this summons to act. So, hopefully I answered the three questions. What is religious liberty? It's a choice for all people to be who you are. Why is it the first freedom? Because it's the foundation to all the others. It's not just happen to be number one in the list. Why is it our most cherished freedom? Because it makes possible life. Now, in response to all that, and that was the document's only like 15 pages. You probably could have read it faster than I talked about it. But in response to this, at the end of this document, the United States Bishop have called for the celebration of a fortnight of freedom, 2 weeks worth of celebrating religious freedom. Of course, I don't know how intentional it was, besides the alliteration, to use a term that's really used just in Great Britain. Right? Sort of revolutionary flair there, I guess. This campaign is a national one, right? Fortnight for Freedom. This website of the United States Bishops offers all kinds of listings of activities, and it's great because the Diocese of Allentown sent their list in. Right? Because we're named Allentown, we're first in the list. Right? Good PR for us. Educational resources, prayer resources, but we've taken it a step further. Bishop Barish, you may know, serves on the Bishops' Committee for Religious Liberty, and so we have taken this a step further, and we've created our own campaign. Not a competition, but a specification of this national campaign, and it is called, cleverly, Let Religious Freedom Ring, right? Which is also the name of the website, which goes live tomorrow. Right? So if you want to find out more information about this. Why? America's freedom, we think, is too sacred for silence. We were going to use the tagline, appealing to a higher authority, but not enough people realized, they thought we just forgot the P. And they didn't realize that's what ringing bells are, so we skipped that one. Right? America's first freedom, too sacred for silence. What is it we're going to do? During these 2 weeks, right, there are various programs for these three actions: praying, learning, acting. That's what the bishops are calling for. You are going to hear about this campaign in your parishes, on the Sunday Masses on the 2 weekends during this fortnight. There will also be, of course, other parish devotions, and essentially, hopefully, a lot of praying for the protection of religious freedom. It's the one tool we have that is special. Right? Learning events. We've scheduled 2 public forums, panel discussions, one at DeSales University, one at Alvernia University, to talk more about this concept. And in each county of the diocese, there's going to be a presentation sponsored by the Knights of Columbus, which will also feature attorneys from the St. Thomas More Society to talk more about the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the courts and that sort of thing. The website, Let Religious Freedom Ring, which, thanks to Mike Keenan's ad agency, they're working on creating this for us, will provide all this information, will provide additional documents, schedules, calendars. But here's the big one. Right? And this is what I really hope you take away from tonight. And this is what I'm begging you to do. Right? At the parishes, there are going to be petition signing events that the Commission for Women will sponsor. But on July 4th, I don't know where you're going to be, hopefully outside at a picnic, our goal is to get every single bell in 5 counties to ring at noon on Independence Day, to remind folks of what freedom really is. So look in your closets, find a bell. Right? You don't have to go anywhere, just go outside and part of the picnic, give a bell to everybody at the picnic. Right? We're going to try to make a whole lot of noise, literally as well as figuratively. This is the beginnings of the website, letreligiousfreedomring.org. All right, there are going to be various quotes that are going to scroll through, as you can see. There already is. Is this accurate, Mike, this countdown?
Yes.
All right, there's your timer. 25 days, 23 hours, 13 minutes, and 9 seconds left till 12 noon on July 4th. All right, till we ring all of those bells. All right, information about the campaign. being informed about religious freedom. There are all kinds of documents, stories, news events, ways that you can take a stand, the calendar of events during this campaign, and videos, beginning with the video from Bishop Barris on the anniversary of the diocese when he preached so well, passionately about religious freedom. You will also find in the AD Times that comes out on June 21st, the beginning of the campaign, there will be inserts in every copy of the newspaper, which we will also make available as kind of fact sheets that you can give to folks, which basically provide all of that same information. Hopefully, you will find it relevant, worthwhile, and so valuable that you will take a part in it. And thank you very much.